I am presenting Union Gospel Press's Sunday School Lesson number 6, Sunday, July 12th, 2026. The lesson is entitled, God Sends a Righteous Branch. Lesson text comes from Jeremiah chapter 23, verses 1 through 8. Related scriptures are John 10, 1 through 16, 25 through 30, Genesis 1, 26 through 28, Isaiah 4, 2 through 6, and 11, 1 through 16, Luke 9, 28 through 36. The place is Jerusalem. The time is probably between 597 and 586 BC. In Lesson 5, we studied Jeremiah's prophecy of the Israelites' return from exile. We saw that prophecy partially fulfilled by various returns to the land, but there is still an element left to be fulfilled. In today's lesson, Jeremiah 23, 1 through 8, we find something similar. God once again promised deliverance to his people through the coming of the righteous branch, a king who would reign according to David's line. The people would dwell in safety, and they would speak of how the Lord brought them out of exile. This prophecy was fulfilled in part by the various returns to the land, as well as by Jesus' first coming. At the same time, we wait for the fullness of the revelation of this prophecy at Jesus' second coming. Today's aim, facts. To know what Jeremiah prophesies regarding God's deliverance of the Israelites through the righteous branch. Principle. To understand that God was faithful to his promises regarding the line of David, despite how his people's unfaithfulness. Application. To tell of Jesus' deliverance of our lives from sin and to wait for his return when his full kingship will be made manifest. Illustrating the lesson. Jeremiah prophesies that Israel and Judah, and by implication all nations that turn to God, will return to the land and dwell under the branch. This branch, called the Lord is our righteousness, is no mere human king, but Jesus, the Son of God incarnate. Practical points. 1. God will judge leaders who take advantage of their positions. We should take leadership seriously. Jeremiah 23, 1 through 2. 2. No matter our circumstances, God is always able to rescue and bless us. Verse 3. 3. Godly leadership is a gift from the Lord, and we must pray for it. Verse 4. 4. Jesus is King. Verse 5. 5. The Lord is our righteousness. Whenever we think we are unworthy, we should take comfort and rest in his worthiness. Verse 6. 6. Although the Exodus was great, God has done and will do even greater things, and we should wait expectantly for him. Verses 7 through 8. Golden text. Behold, the days come, says the Lord, that I will raise unto David a righteous branch, and the king shall reign and prosper, and shall execute judgment and justice in the earth. Jeremiah 23, 5. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first is Shepherds Old and New, Jeremiah 23, 1 through 4. The second is the Davidic King, Old and New, Jeremiah 23, 5 through 6. And the third is the Exodus, Old and New, Jeremiah 23, 7 through 8. Introduction. When King David ushered the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem and established the ancient city as his royal residence, Israel entered its golden age. The promise of the Davidic dynasty captivated God's people as the nation expanded its borders, wealth, and political standing. The divine shepherd had raised up the shepherd king over his people. David and his descendants offered guidance and hope. By Jeremiah's day, however, much had changed. In the years that followed David and his prosperity, the nation suffered greatly under its kingship. After King Solomon abandoned his loyalty to God and his people, the nation fractured. The northern tribes appointed their own king, and the Davidic dynasty exercised authority over the regions of Judah and Benjamin alone. Although southern Israel enjoyed moments of religious and political revival when Hezekiah and Josiah sat on David's throne, most of its kings were wicked. Judah's final kings, those contemporary with Jeremiah, were the worst of all. In Jeremiah 23:1, the prophet identified the kings of Judah as shepherds. By using an occupation so common to the ancient world, the prophet painted an image of the royal office that his audience would understand. Kings were expected to care for their people, just as shepherds were expected to care for their flocks. The tender care and strong leadership required of shepherds were likewise required of Judahite royalty. Bookending the royal collection, Jeremiah 21:1 through 23:8, are passages concerning the nation and its current king, Zedekiah. In the concluding passage, 23:1 through 8, the prophet contrasts Zedekiah with the Messianic king, who would be David's rightful heir. The extent of Jeremiah's contrast, however, does not end there. In verses 1 through 4, God judges the kings as poor shepherds and promised to raise up new ones. Likewise, the Exodus, the event that birthed Israel in Moses' day, is overshadowed by a new Exodus from exile in verses 7 through 8. God's judgment of Zedekiah and the oppressive rulers of Judah was evident, but so was his mercy toward his people. Shepherds new and old. Jeremiah 23:1. Woe be unto the pastors that destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture, saith the Lord. Verse 2. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God of Israel against the pastors that feed my people, ye have scattered my flock and driven them away, and have not visited them. Behold, I will visit upon you the evil of your doings, saith the Lord. Verse 3. And I will gather the remnant of my flock out of all countries whither I have driven them, and will bring them again to their folds, and they shall be fruitful and increase. Verse 4. And I will set up shepherds over them, which shall feed them, and they shall fear no more, nor be dismayed, neither shall they be lacking, saith the Lord. The end of Jeremiah's royal collection begins with judgment against Judah's kings and God's promise of a future restoration. These 4 verses constitute 3 oracles, prophetic speeches that capture the progression of the divine pronouncement. Each oracle is characterized by a shift in person, moving from third person to second person and ending with God speaking in the first person. The first oracle, verse 1. Typical of judgment oracles in the Hebrew Bible, verse 1, begins with the declaration, woe. This biting cry of the prophet ambiguously sets the tone of God's message against the shepherds of Judah. As discussed above, shepherd imagery was commonly used for royalty in the Old Testament and the ancient Near East. According to Jeremiah, the kings were responsible for Babylonians' deportation, and the Judahites and their failure had not gone unnoticed. The second oracle, verse 2. The second oracle picks up the judgment of the previous verse and carries it to the end. Here, the Lord speaks in the second person, addressing the shepherd king directly. The brilliance and rhetorical force of the oracle lie in its wordplay. Although hidden or obscured by most English translation, the creative play of words in Hebrew delivers a devastating blow to the shepherd kings. In his preface to the prophetic woe, verse 2, Jeremiah identified the object of God's judgment as the shepherds who shepherd. In its original language, the phrase is an exact duplicate. The use of shepherding shepherds is emphatic, extenuating the role at which the Judahite kings failed so miserably. In other words, the shepherding shepherd failed to shepherd. Instead, they scattered the flock. Later in the verse, this act is characterized by an additional play on word for shepherd. The Hebrew word for evil sounds nearly identical to the Hebrew word for shepherd. Instead of shepherding God's flock, the shepherding shepherds did evil. Before this word play with shepherds, one also occurs in verse 2. Employing the word range of meaning of the Hebrew word translated visited, Jeremiah contrasted the king's inaction with God's coming action. Because they had failed to visit the flock, that is, to care for the people, God would inhospitably visit the shepherd kings, bringing judgment on them. The third oracle, verses 3 through 4. Continuing the pattern set by the previous oracles, verses 3 through 4 conclude the first unit of the passage. God spoke in first person as he translated from judgment to restoration. After condemning the kings who failed to obey his commands, God turned to his people to offer hope. Although they would endure exile because of the iniquities they and their kings committed, they would not be alone. On the cusp of exile, God promised restoration. Beyond the notable shift from condemnation to restoration, the third oracle stands out for another reason. In the previous two verses, the prophet blamed the shepherd kings for the Babylonian exile, accusing them of scattering God's flock. But in verse 3, God identifies himself as the agent responsible for exile. In time, it was the Lord himself who would drive his people from the promised land. Although God's role in Judah's destruction is nearly revealed in Jeremiah 23, the underlying theology is present throughout the Old Testament. Even in the earliest moments of Israel's history, God warned his people that a pattern of disobedience and sin would result in deportation. Shortly before Israel entered the promised land, Moses reiterated God's covenant and delivered a series of speeches on the plains of Moab. Toward the end of his oration, he outlined the blessing that would come with obedience and the curses that would follow disobedience. Should God's people abandon him and ignore his commands, Exodus would ensure. As Deuteronomy 28:64 prophesies, God would scatter the people among the nations, and they would serve false gods they do not know. Coupled with the illicit theology in Jeremiah 23:3 is the doctrine of the remnant, especially present in the prophetic writings of the Old Testament. The promise of the redeemed remnant often accompanies the warnings about exile. Isaiah 10:20. Despite a bitter and prolonged judgment, God's people would not vanish. Rather, he would raise up a portion of his people from exile and restore them to the land. The remnant would predominantly come from the lowest and weakest strata of the nation, Micah 4:7. Yet, through them, God would fulfill the covenant he made to Abraham to use Israel as the vehicle to bless all nations, Genesis 12:3. God was punishing his people for centuries of disobedience, but he was not abandoning them or the world. The concluding verse of this section promises new shepherd kings, Jeremiah 23:4. After the exile, the Lord God would raise up new leaders who would care for his people. In this promise, Jeremiah picked up the wordplay he used in verse 2. The word for visit, used twice in God's judgment of the shepherd kings, occurs more. In this context, however, it means to be lacking or missing, Numbers 31:49. With the same word, God condemned the kings and promised retribution while also offering hope and promising his people that no one would be missing. The Davidic king, old and new. Verse 5. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will raise up David a righteous branch, and a king shall reign and prosper, and shall execute judgment and justice in the earth. Verse 6. In his days Judah shall be saved, and Israel shall dwell safely, and this is his name whereby he shall be called, the Lord our righteousness. After the three oracles and the progression from judgment to eventual restoration, Jeremiah turned to consider the Davidic king. The epithet Jeremiah used to describe the royal figure is often translated branch, through sprout, or scion. Here might better capture the meaning of the Hebrew word. At a future time, God would raise up a scion for King David, just as he would raise up shepherds to govern his people. Jeremiah 23:4. This descendant would be characterized by righteousness and characteristic emphasized in verses 4 through 5. In this short section, Jeremiah used different forms of the word for righteousness 3 times in his description of the figure. He would be the rightful branch, he would do what is right, and his name would be the Lord of our righteousness. Budding theology. Jeremiah's prophecy of a Davidic heir is the expectant fulfillment of God's promise to David in 2 Samuel 7. Almost 4 generations before Jeremiah's ministry, God declared a covenant with David through the prophet Nathan. God promised the shepherd king that his son would sit on the throne forever. Although the Davidic dynasty ruled Judah for centuries, Jeremiah and the people looked toward an ultimate fulfillment of God's promise, the Messianic king. Using horticultural language similar to Jeremiah's, Isaiah described the messianic figure as a shoot from the now ravaged stump of Jesse, David's father. He would usher in an age of peace and wear righteousness like a belt around his waist. Isaiah 15:1 and 5. In his day, the raiment of God's exiled people would be gathered to him, verses 10 through 11. Political outgrowth. Beyond the passage's theological dimensions and gaze toward the future, Jeremiah's description of the Davidic scion also had a contemporary political function. After 3 years of submission to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, King Jehoiakim rebelled against the tyrant. The revolt failed. As a result, Jehoiakim was killed, and his son Jehoiachin assumed the throne. Following the moral patterns of his predecessors, the young king also did evil in God's sight. 2 Kings 24, 8 through 9. 3 months later, Jehoiachin and his closest companions were seized by Nebuchadnezzar and exiled to Babylon, verse 12. In his place, the Babylonian king set Jehoiachin's uncle Mattaniah as his puppet king over Judea and renamed him Zedekiah, verse 17. When Jeremiah wrote this oracle, Judah was facing a political crisis. Undoubtedly, many debated the legitimacy of the kingship, questioning whether the exiled Jehoiakim or his uncle Zedekiah was the faithful ruler. In response, Jeremiah offered an unexpected alternative. The future scion of David is the true king. He is the rightful branch who does what is right in the land, Jeremiah 23:5. unlike the puppet king Babylon appointed. To emphasize further the contrast between the illegitimate Zedekiah and the rightful branch, Jeremiah took a page from Nebuchadnezzar's book. He called the branch by a new name. Verse 6 renders the name as the Lord our righteousness. This is a clever play on the name Nebuchadnezzar gave to Mattaniah. In Hebrews, Zedekiah means the Lord is my righteousness. By giving the branch a name almost identical to the one Nebuchadnezzar gave Judah's puppet king, the prophet expressed his disappointment in Zedekiah and his anticipation of the rightful branch. Jeremiah's use of the epithet branch locates the text in a larger stream of messianic thought that flows through the Old Testament. Apart from its use in strictly Argerian terms, the title is applied to the future Davidic king in 4 places: Jeremiah 23, 5 through 6, 33, 15 through 16, Zephaniah 3, 8, and 6:12. A smaller designation for the future messianic figure is root of Jesse, which is used in Old Testament prophecy. Jeremiah and Zechariah, the 2 prophets who used the epithet branch, lived during tumultuous times in the nation's history. Jeremiah lived in Jerusalem just prior to the Babylonian invasion and deportation. He witnessed God's people descend into exile for their centuries of idolatry and disobedience. Zechariah, too, stood on the edge of exile, but he was among the remnant that God drew out from Babylon and reestablished in the land. The Exodus, Old and New, verse 7. Therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that they shall no more say, the Lord liveth, which brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. Verse 8. But the Lord liveth, which brought up and which led the seed of the house of Israel out of the north country and from all countries whither I had driven them, and they shall dwell in their own land. After contrasting the wicked rulers of Judah with the promised shepherds and the king Zedekiah with the rightful branch, Jeremiah introduced the final dichotomy of the royal collection, the nation's birth and rebirth. Although the Old Testament, the Exodus is regarded as the birth event of Israel, just as God broke through the waters to create the cosmos, Genesis 1:2, so too did he break through the Red Sea to form the nation of Israel, Exodus 14. It is not surprising then that Jeremiah would reiterate an oath to the Lord that highlighted this event, Jeremiah 23:7. Yet a day would come, the prophet conveyed, when this nation creating event would be overshadowed. Instead, everyone would focus on the nation's rebirth, the return from exile. Unlike the Exodus, which drew God's people out of the south from Egypt, God would draw his people from the north. The land of the north is a common designation in Jeremiah 6:22, 31:8, 59. Its most apparent reference in Babylon through other countries may also be within the prophet's scope. God would bring back the offspring of Israel from every land to which he had scattered them. This second Exodus would eclipse the first, and those whom God uprooted from their soil, 12:14, would dwell on it once again, 23:8. Questions. 1. What is the typical beginning for a judgment oracle, Jeremiah 31? 2. Who does God hold accountable for Judah's captivity? 3. What did the kings fail to do? Verse 2. 4. What did the kings do instead? 5. What did God promise to do for the nation? Verses 3 through 4. 6. What group of people did God promise to appoint for the nation? Verse 4. 7. Who specifically did the Lord promise to send to the nations? Verses 5 through 6. 8. What is that person's name and why was the person chosen? Verse 6. 9. Why is the Exodus important to Israel's identity? Verse 7. 10. Why is it significant that the return from the north will eclipse the Exodus from Egypt? Verse 8. This concludes the Sunday school lesson for Sunday, January 12th, 2026. Thank you for listening. Please remember to click the subscribe tab. God bless.